Ladies and gents, this is the moment you've been waiting for. A podcast for podcasters. This is Creating the Greatest Show, and I'm your host, Casey Cheshire. Join me as we interview podcast hosts and investigate the ingredients of a successful interview podcast. We'll talk mistakes, earned skills, powerful questions, and more. This show is sponsored by Ringmaster, completely done for you B2B podcast production. I hit it. We can't go back. We must go forward. I'm excited. My guest today, I've had a chance to work with him for a while now, and I'm excited to pick his brain on podcasting. He is a seasoned podcaster. He's a marketing leader and thought leader, a content strategist, a customer experience storyteller. He's the host of the Conversations That Matter podcast. And I got to say, of the podcasters that I know, he is one that cares. And that's a core value for me. So I noticed this stuff. He cares about the guests, about the questions, about the output. It really puts intention behind everything he does. So that's why I just can't wait to peel back the onion and share with all of you the kind of conversations I've had with him. The customer marketing lead at Uniphore, Randy Ksar. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me. That's a great intro, and I'm so excited to peel the onion, as you say. So let's get to it.
And hopefully it's one of those sweet onions so we don't start crying midway through the show. You know, it's not one of those shows, right? So, Randy, let me ask you this question that kicks things off and starts things out. Pull back the curtain for us on your show and share your most important strategy for a great interview podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I've been podcasting since 2008. And I think for me, one of the key things, and you know, I get asked this question a lot, is what makes a good host. I think what makes a good host is knowing yourself, knowing that are you the right person to be the host, which, you know, sometimes if you just want to get the project started, like you just got to do it,
right?
Know, or else it's going to take, you know, a few extra months to get approvals, and you just like, let's just do it. But I think it's really also, you know, the question of like, do you know yourself is around tone and around style, around your own story. And so I think those are the key things. Is like, how do you want to be portrayed? How do you want people to know you? And does that come across in the podcast? Now, of course, the guests are most important. They're your subject matter experts if you're doing an interview style. But also you want to, you know, people are interested in you too, believe it or not. And sometimes, you know, the host of the podcast kind of gets the shaft because you never really get to know them. But because you're never the one being interviewed, but I think it's really crucial to be able to be confident with yourself that you can ask the right questions. One of the first things I realized in a podcast is, you know, you can have technical difficulties, and there's going to be these odd moments of silence when your guests are perhaps not on anymore because of some technical difficulties, and you have to be confident in yourself to fill those gaps. I'll tell you a quick story when that happened. When I first started podcasting, we were using a service called Blog Talk Radio. It was purely just you call an 800 number and your guest calls it in, and it's like a radio show. It streams live to the web. I don't even know if it's around anymore. But there were times where the technology wasn't working, and someone hung up. They had a bad connection. They were, you know, sound like they were in a tunnel, whatever it might be. And there were times where people just like, you're like, okay, I guess they're gone. You know, and they would call back a few minutes later. But for those few minutes, you're like, all right, now it's time for your, you know, comedy improv
right
time. So it's tough, but I think as you know, practice, as they say, makes not perfect, but progress.
Do you think that's something you can train? Like for people out there listening, if you haven't had one of these moments happen, they're eventually going to. Can you prepare for those, or is it just that you're going to go through them and eventually you've gone through enough of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that you can prepare for those moments because most people don't know those moments exist.
Right.
So I think if you're looking to either hire a podcast agency or perhaps find someone internally that's the podcast host because maybe they have a better they're the extrovert versus introvert. You want to train them on those moments of time where there's, the guest hasn't connected because of technical issues, or maybe the guest isn't answering correctly, and you need to kind of keep them engaged, and because you know that the audience is listening. So I think those type of moments you definitely can train for. I guess the question is, are there some people more, not necessarily familiar, but more natural in dealing with those situations? I think so.
Yeah. Like there's people that are great at adapting, and there's people that prefer to plan, right? And so it's almost like the planners should plan for this to happen. Like even hearing it on this podcast might be enough for people to go, what would I say? What would I do if suddenly my guest just dropped off or their mic didn't work? And would I pause? Would I ask a question? And to your point, if you're live, you got to keep going.
Yeah, for sure. Got to keep going. Got to keep telling the story.
So let me take you back to the original part here. First of all, are you the right person? Is there a litmus test? How do you know you're the right person?
Well, if it's an audio podcast, even video, let's talk. It was just like an audio podcast. If it's just an audio podcast, I think there's a couple of things. One is just the audio. Like, do you sound interesting? Are you sounding like you're interested in the person that you're asking the questions to?
Right.
If you don't, then no one's going to want to listen to that. Say you're it's just like you're at a party and you're probably right next to someone having a conversation. If it's not interesting, you're not going to want to listen to it. You're going to look like, all right, I'm going to go get a drink or go talk to someone else.
Time for a refill, right? I got to go.
And yeah. I mean, if you think about it, how many podcasts are out there these days, right? Your podcast player that you launched this podcast on, you have so many different options.
Right.
If you're not engaged with it within the first, I would say 3 minutes, then you're going to be like, all right, I'm going to go find another show that maybe has, I don't know, I was just listening to Smartless. Like, I'm going to go find a celebrity show that's a little more, interesting. Not that anybody would do it on this show. Just no, say that.
Because
right.
because we're both fantastic, and we've been dropping legendary info for the first 3 minutes. And that's I want to get back to I'll come back to the 3 minute thing because that's really interesting. But you were mentioning, tone is important, style is important, story is important. How do you want to be portrayed? I feel like we've talked just now about tone, the idea of like you showing interest, and if you're interested, the audience is, and if you're not, they're definitely not going to be. Talk to me about style. What does that mean? What does a podcast host style entail?
Yeah, I think the style is your own. Like, we talked about what do you want to be known for. Like, people know you for not only your subject matter expertise, but also for how you ask questions, for how you are in a conversation, for how you're engaging in conversation. And so I think that's something that comes across pretty quickly in terms of impressions and first impressions. And so it's not always the topic or the subject matter that people want to tune into a podcast. It's also the actual host.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely something that you need to put some effort in to make sure that you are saying the right things, that you know how to lead a conversation, that the style that you want to portray is what you want to be known for.
Yeah. And I think the big trap with the style is being yourself, being really authentic and not trying to fake someone else's style. I always think back to, Gary Vee's super popular, and then you get a bunch of marketers all trying to be Gary Vee, dropping F-bombs left and right, like they're Gary Vee wearing a Gary Vee hat, And, and totally. I feel like we can all tell, maybe they didn't get the memo, but we can tell, the audience can tell if there's this sort of air of, like you're not being authentic. We can smell that or something.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally true. Like people can see BS a mile away. So if you are I don't know, say you're interviewing a customer and you're trying to make it sound like just embellishing them way too much, you're giving them a pat on the back way too much. People just see that a mile away. So I think that the way that your style is needs to be authentically you.
Yeah.
My background, a lot of it is in social. So when we write social content, we're making sure that we write in a very human, authentic, and engaging way. And so the same thing with a podcast is that you need to make sure that you're doing that. If you can't recreate the conversation with this subject matter expert on your podcast at Starbucks, then it shouldn't be on a podcast. I feel like if you can't have like a real conversation with them outside the podcast, then you shouldn't be having a conversation with them.
What do you mean by that? Like if you couldn't sit down with anyone at Starbucks or with your customer, or what's the test there?
Like when you in a public space, when you're say waiting in line at Starbucks and you're having a conversation with someone that you've never met before, that person, you're not going to sell them outright, right? You need to get to know them. You need to know who they are, what they do, why are you here, how's your day going. That also needs to come across in the style of conversation that you do with a podcast guest. At least that's my feeling.
That's your, but that's interesting to listen to, right? It's conversation with two people, and they're waiting for something else, and they're being nice to each other, and you never know who you're going to meet, right? So that's fun to listen to, and I can see why. And that sounds like your style, though, right? Because I know there's like a Tim Ferriss of the world who's like, I'm just going to pepper this guy with questions, and I'm not going to have any conversation, right? Tell me your answers and get out of here, right? And I guess to each their own. But back to your original point, like if your style is that, then by all means do that.
Yeah, and again, it's different for different people. So, but that's just the way I've been brought up, is like have a conversation with them, get to know their backstory, really be interested in why they made certain decisions in their life. So that's how I go about doing any of the podcasts I do.
Do you ever find that the backstory is sometimes more fascinating than everything else?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes when you're interviewing these guests and they work for, say, a company, and they haven't done it before, they get really like podcast deer in the headlight.
Yeah,
don't really know how to say the story of the company, and so they get very rigid. They're very like structured in their answers. And you get these odd moments of silence. And you're like, all right, how do we transition to the next question? So I think it really helps when you have those kind of when you ask them about their passions or maybe their families.
Yeah,
that's what I do usually when we before we start, to get them kind of like a little relaxed, a little loose, because a lot of stuff that I do is remote. But even when I do it in person, I try and like, not just how's your day going, because people just say the obvious, like, oh, it's going great, when you know full well that there's some backstory there. But you really want to try and get to know what their passions are, who is important in their life, what do they do outside of work. Those are the type of things that people, all of a sudden their smile comes up. You get those great authentic answers.
And not a lot of people get asked about their past either, In an interview, you get asked usually about your job history. So I feel like there's something special we get to do when we ask someone about their story, their life, and they get to tell us about picking raspberries as a kid or whatever the case may be, and whatever was special to them. It's kind of, have you ever had those Oprah moments where someone shares something powerful about their past and you're kind of like, oh man, is this okay to record? Like, is this okay?
Yeah, I mean, I've had it definitely numerous times, but I think there was one point where I was doing a prep call with someone, and I didn't realize we're talking about the podcast and what to expect, and giving them some ideas for answers, and then somehow we started getting into our backgrounds, and that's when he just started opening up. And it was really cool, because we all of a sudden our values were the same. So we were talking about faith and religion, and it just was something that I've never really talked about with a guest before. And so that was really cool to see that within the prep call. Not that we talked about on the actual podcast, but it made for a more authentic and trustworthy conversation. When we started recording the actual podcast.
That's huge. I want to highlight that for people. I heard a powerful topic came up in the prep, and even though it doesn't make it into the show, it like you had that much more of a connection going into the show because you realized you had some values that were aligned. And I've had that sense too, where you're excited to talk to the person. You're like, oh man, that's my whatever guy, and that's the cool. I'm excited for it. Like it separates it. So it's not just another, I got to do another podcast with someone's, some guy, some business guy or gal. It's like, no, this is this person. I'm really excited for this episode, even if we don't talk about that at all.
Yeah. I mean, the goal is that you're building a relationship, right? Even though it could be just one episode, your hope is that this person both of you can be of value to each other. So hopefully the conversation that you have is not just a one way, that they're actually getting value from what you're saying and how you're listening and answering back to their responses. So that's, I think, is something important to remember, that we talk about this in the influencer marketing world, is that it's not just a one-time relationship. This is a longer-term relationship where you bring value to each other's businesses. So same, when you're talking about a podcast guest, it's the same thing.
We're so aligned on this, right? So I care so much about relationships and connections that, that's even our company why is to create human connection, right? It's so important. But the idea, I love that we're focusing on it for a second. The idea, it's not a one-time relationship, which is interesting to me. And then also creating value for them. And I was thinking initially that you were talking about afterward, you're creating value for them. But it sounds like you're even thinking about how can I create value for them while they're a guest? Is that right?
Well, yeah. I think one of the things that we talk about on Conversations That Matter is we want people to get 1% better. This is a community-driven show where we bring in questions from the audience. We also are inviting guests onto the show because they're relatable to other peers within the industry. And I think that's a key thing when you are trying to learn from each other. Not only are they sharing kind of what their insights, what their challenges were and how they overcome them, but I know for me, since I've been in the industry for a while, I also try and share my expertise and how it relates to them. And so my hope is that not only can I share what I've gone through, but also we've done 60, I forgot what the number is, 60 something episodes so far, close to that.
Yeah.
I can bring lessons I've learned from other guests to them too, and be like, actually, Joe Smith said the exact same thing. He was having the same problem, and this is how he overcame it. And that can help the guests I'm talking to in their daily life, in their job, in the challenge that they're going through.
Hey, 1% better, 60 times later, now we're 60% better.
You would hope.
I wonder if this ties in. I was going to ask you about the last part of that sequence, the tone, the style, the story. And I wonder if is that 1% part of your story for Conversations That Matter? Or what do you mean by story?
I mean, the story, it's something that needs to be relatable. The story has a beginning, a climax, and an end. That story needs to be super relatable to people, especially for the target personas that you're trying to reach in your podcast. Right? Just like with everybody, the podcast has a goal, and it has a target audience that you're going for. It is a business. We have to remind ourselves of that. I mean, yes, you're having a good time, you're talking with your peers, but at the end of the day, it's also, you have to be a little selfish and why am I spending all this time doing it? Why am I making this investment? It's for, especially in the B2B world, for a brand like ours, we're trying to make sure we build relationships and talk potentially to our prospects that can then be turned into actual leads and actual customers.
How often do you remind yourself of that? Because I think I was talking about how intentional you are. It's great to hear you bring that up. The idea of let's not lose sight of the goal. Like, we're not going to go interview Ronald McDonald. Like, or maybe we will. There's a goal we're trying to achieve. How do you remind yourself of that?
Like when we talk together with Liam on our show, I'm always reminded of who our target audience is. Who are we trying to reach? And that is helpful for him in finding the right people that we've talked about, and also writing the pitch and deciding on the themes and topics. So everything needs to relate back to the goal of what we're trying to do. We need to make sure that whatever story that we're telling or whatever story that we're hearing from that audience is relatable, is back to the original kind of goal of what the show is. So like if we're doing an AI show, talking about the latest AI innovation and how it relates to customer experience, well, that guest needs to somehow weave back into that. And then from that show, the social content needs to weave back into that, and the blog post and whatever other marketing channels that we amplify it on.
Do you ever find that restrictive? I mean, you can't just have a random person on because you have a goal, right? It's not the Randy Ksar show. It's like, this is a business pod, and
that's a good question. I mean, I think your audience is human just like anybody else.
Yeah.
They might get tired of the stale old show over and over again.
Yeah, right.
And sometimes it's good to change it up. So if there's someone that, I don't know, say we have Simon, what's his name? Simon Sinek on. He's not an AI, innovator or thought leader, but is he going to provide huge value to people in doing their job, no matter the industry they're in, no matter the seniority that they have?
Yeah,
for sure. Would I have, I don't know, a celebrity like Bradley Cooper on? Sure, I would love that. And would people be interested in listening to it? Yeah. Would I change my whole guest outreach based upon him? No. But I think it would bring a kind of a little break in the action. But also, you just need to find what's relatable to that person's life and how it relates to your target audience. So I think it's always possible.
I mean, and I love the idea. This is a cool concept, right? Because I think sometimes we can get so serious and wrapped up in our business goals that we forget, like you just said, that our listeners are human. We're human. Throw us a bone here. We've seen this with business copywriting and marketing copywriting. We don't, if you read something and it looks like it's written by a marketer, it's probably bad copy now, right? Because we can tell. So, or ChatGPT made it. So it's like we want that human experience. So, but at the end of the day, can you draw a line between Bradley Cooper and AI? Do you think?
I don't know about AI, but AI has so many subtopics to it, and maybe one of them is experience.
True. And conversations, right?
And conversations. And so could that be related to him? I mean, the reason I bring him up, I was just listening to an episode of Smartless, and he made a guest appearance on one of the podcasts. Should
we try to book him for Conversations That Matter?
Whatever podcast, I don't know. It doesn't matter to me. We'll book him. So yeah, I think it's you can change the way your podcast is structured.
Yeah.
So it's not just the guests and who it is, but maybe there's a portion of your podcast that you can switch it up. Take a look at the late shows they're on, Jimmy Fallon and others. They have all these little games in between the show, right? Because they don't want to have a whole 45 minutes or whatever the time is for just that interview with that celebrity or musician. They need to kind of switch it up, right? And they do that. You can see them. They're coming up with new games and new ways to engage the audience based upon trends, based upon just new creative ideas. And so the same thing could be done with your podcast is you tried it out for a good, say, 60 episodes.
Yeah,
now
right.
it's time to change and add a little more, I guess, spice to your podcast.
Sure.
So I think it's possible. And I mean, that's the good thing about podcasts and any digital content. You can do some A/B testing, try it out, see how people resonate, get some feedback, and kind of go from there.
I can see that really being fun for the host too, right? Because we can get into these Groundhog Days, whereas it's another guest. We're talking about, and they're talking about the exact thing that somebody 4 episodes talked about, and we're trying to get their own perspective, but it can be crazy. So just the idea of being free enough to switch it up, I mean, there literally are shows where you eat hot wings with celebrities, right? So if they can pull that off, what can't they pull off,
Yeah. No, that's so true. Those 2 guys are geniuses.
Yeah,
how they actually got the first guest to do it and subsequent guests is amazing. So
I wonder if that, between the 2 ferns started that trend of just like ridiculous but serious,
just jibber jabber. Yeah.
Yeah. How many hot wings do you think would you make it? Would you make it the whole way?
Oh my gosh. I think by like 3, I would be just like toast.
Yeah. Has anyone not done them all?
No, I think everyone's gone through. I guess when it came down to it, would I just kind of power through? Yes, but I probably would be stuck in the bathroom for the next, 6. I need a hotel room and whatever, and no sunlight and just like sleep it off for a few days.
Drinking some milk, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, for me that wouldn't work. I'm lactose intolerant, so
that really wouldn't work. It's trading one problem for another.
Exactly. Some almond milk or oat milk, something like that. Yeah. But yeah, that's again. I think that the point I think I'm trying to make is you can switch it up, have some fun with it. It doesn't need to be the whole show. It could be just a portion, of it, and I think it could work out.
Let's talk prep. Let's talk prep for a little bit. How do you like to prepare for shows and for guests?
Well, one is I want to do research on them. I want to find out, go to their LinkedIn profile, see what they've posted, see what they've shared recently, see what comments they've gotten. I'll do a YouTube search and see if they've spoken on other podcasts or maybe at different events. Just want to see their style, what they've been asked before. If I have someone that has their own podcast or maybe's appeared numerous times, is just making the AI or CX show circuit, I don't want to interview them with the same questions.
Yeah. So if you hear they keep getting asked that one question, you're like, man, how do we mix it up here?
Tell us about your book. Well, they're on a book tour. So everyone's heard that same spiel over and over again. So I think it's a matter of personalizing it as best as you can, diving into who they are and the content that they are, because they have a goal too, especially if they're a consultant or author, they want to promote their stuff on our show. So I think it's just a matter of trying to get a little more personal in terms of the questions that you ask. That's is personal not in terms of them, but in terms of the content that they're trying to share.
It's like one of the greatest compliments when you ask that question and someone's like, man, that's a great question. You're like, aha.
Yes. I've never been asked that before.
Yeah, I've never been asked that before. You're like, all right. You're like, oh, yeah, cool. That's it. But inside, you're like, yeah, that was my goal.
Exactly. Nailed it.
You're right. Exactly. Do you have any strategies for getting to those questions? I've heard from you, watching videos to know what not to ask because, man, they get that all the time. But how do you find those unique ones?
I think it's a lot of times it's community driven. So trying to understand what's out there in the community that they can react to. So for instance, if they are in customer experience, or let's take not my industry, let's take healthcare.
Yeah.
And there's a show, I'm talking to the latest physicians or nurse practitioners. Maybe there's an influencer that's out there that's posted something that they can react to. Now, granted, you need to give them a heads up. so that's not too controversial. But that could be a way of doing it, right? So not using their content, but what it does is that it shows their expertise. It shows that person can share their opinion, and that is a thought leader, right? And that's the person that you want, that people can relate to, and maybe your audience might have the same answer, or they, for even better purposes, it might not be the same answer, and they're like, you know what, I don't agree with that, and they'll write back to you or comment on social. So I think that's something that you can do.
The idea of the reaction videos is actually brilliant. I don't think it's something I've thought about, but yet I've watched these on YouTube all the time. Like, reaction videos are very interesting. People reacting to either another video or something they've read. It's really interesting, and it busts them out of that cycle. And you mentioned interviewing authors. And sometimes the challenge I have with authors is they're so polished that they can slip in to robot mode very easily and start answering, even if you didn't, especially if you ask them one of those questions, but even if you don't, they can slip back into that same pattern. And they're, one of the authors I talked to, he had done like 150 pods, and he scheduled them all to launch the day that his book launched, right? Brilliant. But he was tired and he didn't really care about the show. And so, man, they can slip into that stuff. So the idea of having them react to something gets them out of that.
I mean, one of the greatest pieces of social content that I've seen work really well, not on a podcast, but on a late show, is mean tweets. I don't know if you've seen that before, right?
No.
It's usually on Jimmy Kimmel. I think that's what he does it on. And it's celebrities reading their own people that mention them on Twitter. Or now
people hating on them on Twitter?
Yeah, just commenting on whatever it is. And they actually read it out loud. And so they have to either keep a straight face, or they laugh about it, or they have some, not necessarily negative reaction, because that's Jimmy Kimmel ain't going to throw them on the bus.
They'll pick something pseudo mean yeah.
But that, I think the key thing is, like, if you can pull out from the community that they're a part of, that's going to be, great for them, because now all of a sudden they are put in a spot where they can really leverage their expertise and authority to their peers.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's why I just love doing that, either in a rapid fire session, towards the end of the podcast, or even just in the beginning, just to kind of jumpstart it and get an opinion going. Especially,
it almost reminds me of like newsjacking, especially if it's a topic that people are searching, they're interested, they want to know what the hot take is. Makes for a great YouTube short. Man, I could see that just hooking people in. Hey, man, what's your take on that recent disaster that happened over there? If that's their industry or whatnot, or what's your take on X, Y, Z?
Yeah.
Powerful. And because it's timely, they haven't been asked that before. So it's like fresh.
Yeah. So, I would curate something from the past week or two from an influencer within their community and say, what do you think? This is what this so-and-so person said, and go at it.
What about the guest that is basically a CIA operative because their LinkedIn profile hasn't been updated since they were in high school, and now they're the CEO of a successful company, and there's like nothing on them, right? How do you create a unique experience for those kind of people?
I think for those people, you need to make sure that they feel comfortable in speaking, that you find out what their true passion is. Because if you can't tell from the research that you're doing, or their bios, or what they're promoting, then you really have no clue what's going to happen, right? And you as a podcast host need to know in advance, to a point, what they're going to share. So if you do ask them a question off the cuff, that what they potentially could say, or that that answer is going to be money and going to be a good microclip that you can amplify. And there are times there's some people that aren't active on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn isn't the best place to outreach them. Yeah, and I think it's just a matter of that prep call is going to be key.
True.
Learning about their story, you might need to do a couple prep calls to get it to a point that you feel comfortable with. And the key thing is, if it's not the right host, maybe just their job title is perfect, and you're like, that's my target audience. But it's, you meet them in person, and like, it just ain't, you're not vibing. It's just not working. Then maybe it won't be a good episode. So you should feel confident that, I love that we create a relationship and that, we talked with each other, but don't think this is going to be a good thing that we can do together. So you should feel confident that you can say no, even after the prep call.
Okay, so two things there. One, prep call totally makes sense. That's the place where you discover what they forgot to put on all their social platforms. But two, the ability to say no to guests.
It's hard.
It's hard.
Yeah, because you've already built that like anticipation.
How do you do it? Do you have any tips?
It's hard. It's hard for me. I mean, I think I give people the benefit of the doubt. I want them to be successful. That's just kind of my nature, and so I think it's just a matter of being honest.
Yeah.
And most people, if you're honest, then it's okay, right? You haven't wasted their time, and and they'll be okay with that. So right. As long as you're honest, then you'll be okay.
Because you're saving them from pain. Back in the day, I have a story for you. Back in the day, I was at a networking event in a city that I was traveling to, and I was having a good time. I might have had a couple beverages. I met someone that was a really cool person. And I was like, you should be on my podcast, right? And it's a B2B marketing podcast, and she focused on B2C and which isn't a deal breaker, but and so, fast forward several weeks later, we're on a prep call. I guess this is another vote for why you do prep calls, because we got on that thing and I'm telling her the questions and she's thinking in her mind, that's like a foreign language to me, and we kind of just agreed on that call that she had someone she knew that might be a better fit for this particular show, and
true.
And man, so much respect to that versus us both knowing it and still doing it, and it's just feeling like a waste of time for us and the audience.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think sometimes it could be a lead-in to someone else.
True.
And especially if it's someone within the industry, it's a pretty small industry, no matter the size of it. I mean, there's people network so much. And so it might be an opportunity for them to introduce you to someone else.
Yeah.
One of the things that we ask on our podcast after we hit, the end button is, who else do you think I should interview? And I think that's a great question, because that just opens up not only more relationships, but you can see whether it's a good podcast or not based upon whether they answer you truthfully.
Yeah.
Right. And so you've done a good job if they actually give you some recommendations.
Man, what a great way to get guests too. Especially you have a great guest, you really hit it off. Who else should I talk to? This show is super meta. So I'm going to, we talk about things that we're doing if we're not doing them. So I'm definitely going to have to ask you that question at the end of the show. Who else should we talk to? Yeah, what a great tip, because then they're like self-selecting, and I've had folks even be helpful, not just tell me a name, some like cold outreach. They'll introduce me on email. That's great. You get a little, hey, here's my new friend, and here you should have this person on. Oh man, they're amazing. And then it's almost like exponential at that point for the pod. Yeah. So I've got a bit of a hypothetical question for you next. So I may or may not have a time machine up here in New Hampshire, right? So you come visit, we get some beer, some lobster, and we go in the time machine and we get the chance to go a year later, 50 plus podcast episodes into the future, and we get a chance to listen to your podcast. What do you want it to sound like? Is it the same? Is it different? Have you made changes to it, a year from now? What does it sound like?
Good question. One is weaving in customer stories in a non-salesy way.
I like it.
There is, I forgot what the show was, Gimlet Productions. I don't know if you remember them.
Yeah.
Back when. they used to do, so they record, their first season was recording themselves on creating a podcast company.
Right.
It was fascinating. They were pitching the top, I forgot who it was. He was a shark. Anyways, they were pitching in VCs and going through their business plans and dealing with their family. But then in the middle of each episode was a very well produced ad that didn't feel like an ad. It felt like it was just a customer. Or they took the sponsor, say it was stamps.com, and they just talked to a customer at stamps.com and made it into something that was really interesting and engaging. So that's what they were known for, is that like middle portion. Yes, the podcast got them a lot of fame, and they I think they got bought up by, was it Spotify?
I think so. Yeah, one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I love to see that woven in. And I have a role that focuses on customer marketing, so that would be really cool for us to do that. And then I think where I like to see some changes, in the future is how can we probably be more timely in relating to trends.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I love to take the show on the road. I think interviewing remotely is great, and it'll still happen. But I think if I can go to different either customers or industry events, I love doing that. I did that in the past, and that always gives I love hearing the background noise at an event, even though people might think it's loud. That just knows that you're right in the middle of a community that is just like their brain is just like trying to learn, right?
And a good mic, you only hear it as like a nice little background,
Yeah. So I love, those are the things that, I want to weave in, and, we'll work on that together.
Yeah, it's really interesting about you tying into Gimlet. So if the pod starts focusing on are you interviewing customers and then there's another customer interview in the middle, or how do you see that going together?
Well, I think as anybody builds their podcast, people need to be reminded of who the podcast is from.
Yeah.
And I think that's an area where, okay, you built this audience, you have this initial reach. That's kind of the phase one, right? It's like the influencer phase, the initial set of audience listeners. Phase two is when you start getting those influencers to share and spread the word and amplify your podcast content. And once that happens, people need to know that it relates back to the original brand. And so, of course, you're going to have it within the intro and outro. But as we know, people don't listen all the time to the full podcast. They need that in-between reminder. And I think it needs to be done in a creative way.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't feel like an ad, then they're going to want to know what that story is in the middle.
Those are the best ads when it's a customer talking about experience, and they're just because they're almost naturally real with you about it because you're peers, and it's interesting, especially if it's a story based on a story. And then what's cool is it adds to the value, right? Instead of detracting, like, oh God, I got to skip this 30 seconds. Where's my forward button?
Yeah, no. Yeah, totally.
It's like, oh, that was interesting. Okay, now back to your show. Okay, all right.
I mean, that's what you do. You're like, all right, and here's a story from brand A that recently implemented XYZ.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's related to the topic that you did. And then it's going to take some production, right? It's going to take a little extra work. But I think if you have 3 or 4 of those in your bucket that you can weave into different podcasts, then I think it's going to be great.
That's cool. I look forward to seeing that happen, man. Where can people reach out? They want to connect with you, fellow podcasters, information about Uniphore and Conversations That Matter, all the things.
Yeah, so the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. Just hit me up there. Open book. You can also email me at randy.ksar@uniphore.com. And otherwise, love to talk podcasting, digital, social, customer marketing, podcasting, in any degree, whether you're just starting off or whether you've been doing it for as long as I have. So.
Hell yeah. And I got to say, people, check out Conversations That Matter. We're going to link to it in the show notes. Again, intentional about outcomes, going back to the goal we talked about at the very beginning. What's the goal? What kind of person do I want to present myself as? A story, all this stuff. It's a masterclass, Randy. So I want people to go check it out. Thank you for being on here, man. I don't know if you've had fun. I look at the clock, the time's just flown by. But I really appreciate you coming on here and just hanging out for a bit.
Dude, I loved it. I love the conversation. I learned from you as well. I mean, I love that we work together, and I love this podcast. So definitely give it a good rating for those of you listening in if you enjoyed the content today.
Hell yeah, man. And for those listening, if you learned something, and I freaking know you did, because I literally have 2 pages of notes front and back, then share this with someone else. Be a thought leader, one person, or 2, or 9, or 4,000, whatever the number is. But like good information in other people's hands. Do it on LinkedIn. Tag Randy. Tag myself. We'll hop in the comments. We'll have a little conversation about it. And with that, Randy, thank you again, sir.
Yeah, no problem. Have a great day.
All right, everyone. This has been another crazy episode of Creating the Greatest Show. We will catch you all next time. And next time doesn't have to be next week. Life's too short, and we have way too much to talk about. Find show notes full of takeaways, lessons, and links at creatingthegreatestshow.com. For more information on launching your own podcast or working with us to produce your existing show, come on down to the big tent at ringmaster.com. Until then, friends, whatever you do, do it with all your might. Work at it, if necessary, early and late, in season and out of season, not leaving a stone unturned and never deferring for a single hour that which can be done just as well now. P.T. Barnum.